Hello everyone, I am back with another video, and today I am so excited to be reviewing Final Fantasy XII, the Zodiac Age. I just rolled credits about 2 weeks ago, wanted to allow some time before I recorded my review to really allow the experience to digest a bit before sharing my thoughts, but I have a lot of great things to say. I really did thoroughly enjoy this JRPG and another game, mainline game in the Final Fantasy series. And maybe fittingly enough, the last review that I recorded for my YouTube channel nearly 11 years ago was Final Fantasy XIII. So I guess we're kind of just making our way backwards in the series on this channel and reviewing those games. But we're going to be getting into the story, no spoilers, the combat, the incredible soundtrack, the benefits of this remaster that came out in 2017 versus the original PlayStation 2 game that came out nearly 17 years ago, if you can believe that. And then, of course, how it compares to some of the other Final Fantasy games that I've played. I know people were curious when I was talking about it on Twitter. How does it compare to Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy IX? We're going to be getting into all of that over the course of the review. So what do you say we jump right in? So for those completely unfamiliar with the game, Final Fantasy XII is set in this beautiful land named Ivalice, which I was actually surprised to find out is also the setting for the PS1 RPGs, Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story. I don't believe there's any strong story thread connections between these three games. I just thought it was really cool that they kind of share the same setting. But getting back to 12 here, the game begins with this really kind of bombastic celebration wedding between two characters, Princess Ashe and Prince Razzler. Oddly enough, the festivities have this striking resemblance to the parades and kind of fireworks display at the end of Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, Star Wars, after Darth Maul was killed. But more on the similarities to Star Wars in a little bit. Without going into too much detail, and also in an effort not to completely lose my audience here with the complexities of the story, a lot of people say that Final Fantasy XII can be overly political, kind of gets a little crazy, detailed into the war and the politics of it all. It can really be boiled down to this graphic here, where you have these two kingdoms, Dalmasca, where Princess Ashe is from, and Nebradia, where Prince Razzler's from. And as you can see, they sit between these two larger nations where these two have been at war with one another for quite some time. So, of course, those being Arcadia and Rosaria. And your main six cast of characters, who we'll get into here in just a moment, who are all unique in their own rights, they all kind of band together in an effort to de-escalate the tensions between these two countries so that the two nations in between, Dalmasca and Nebradia, aren't completely wiped off the map. So that's really what it can be boiled down to. I'm not going to go into any greater detail necessarily, just because, one, it can get a little convoluted, and two, I don't really want to spoil anything. But shortly after those opening cinematics, you are eventually introduced to one of the main protagonists. His name is Vaughn, and he's this young, aspiring sky pirate. Naturally, he has a run-in with two of the other main characters, one being Balthier, who is this incredibly slick, sly, suave, already well-established sky pirate who is traveling with, we'll say, his furry companion. Her name is Fran, and they all agree after recent story events, and I won't go too into spoilers here. This is literally like 45 minutes into the game that'll help lay the foundation for the rest of the review, and I won't say much more. But they all agree after recent story events to rescue a princess. I don't know, maybe the Star Wars superfan is kind of wrongfully drawing connections to the original trilogy, A New Hope in particular, just because of some of the character motivations early on in Final Fantasy XII, but I was all there for it. Seriously, it's really well done, and Balthier, he's absolutely the Han Solo of the Final Fantasy series, and I love it. He's definitely become one of my favorite characters in all of the Final Fantasy games that I've played to this point, but overall, from a story perspective, I don't really think it's the strongest story in Final Fantasy games that I've played. I was much more intrigued in exploring the world of Ivalice and its kind of surrounding lore than I was the main story beats being played out over the course of the game. But that's not to say that the story isn't good. I really do think there's a serviceable, strong-ish foundation there from a story perspective. It's just not the main thing that I'm going to be thinking about years down the line when I think about Final Fantasy XII. I also felt like the characters overall grew on me quite a bit as the story progressed. Really that final act of the game, I think everything comes together really well and the characters seem a bit more fleshed out than they really did. And I would say the first third to two-thirds of the game, of the 6 party members, there was really only 2 that I was truly invested in seeing how their arcs were going to progress. One being Balthier, just because I love Han Solo, and Balthier really does give off the Han Solo energy, and Fran being another, just because her and Balthier's story really go hand in hand with one another. Vaughn as well, he's certainly a likable protagonist, but again, all in all, I feel like the cast of characters wasn't as strong as some of the other Final Fantasies, but still good and unique in their own rights. But it is worth noting, whether I was interested in what they were saying all the time or not, especially when they got kind of into the political, convoluted nature of the war and everything that was going on or surrounding it, the voice acting is incredibly strong in Final Fantasy XII.
I was running away. I needed to get away from his death. That's why I followed you. You know what? I'm through with it. I'm through running. I'm ready to find my purpose. To find some real answers. Some reasons. If I stick with you, I think I will.
I think our friends over at Square Enix knew that they needed to up their game after the sheer memeability of the voice acting in Final Fantasy X. Now, the thing I loved most about Final Fantasy XII, and why I will remember this game fondly for years to come, was because of its combat system. Now, to this point in the Final Fantasy series, excluding the MMO FF11, 12 is the first game to not have random encounters, surprisingly enough, where instead you're exploring these sprawling landscapes, jungles, beachfronts, or dungeons, and enemies are visible on the battlefield, and you can choose to either engage with them, or there's a button that you can just flee, run right past them. But as you attack, there are these target lines connecting you and your party to the enemy, and the enemy to your party, and depending on the color of these connecting lines, that kind of indicates whether or not you're going to be using magic, you're using an item, a technique, or just a generic attack. And so each character takes turns as these meters next to the character's names refills, not unlike some of those earlier PS1 Final Fantasy games. And then you can also issue commands, attack, magic, items, or whatever else, for any party member at any time. So while you do have a main party leader kind of commanding the group, at any given moment, with a click of a button, you can swap to any other character and either issue a command or be the one kind of controlling that person on the battlefield, which I found pretty unique. What's also pretty unique about Final Fantasy XII, and on the surface, it might look quite a bit like Xenoblade Chronicles if you're familiar with that game, but 12 adds another layer to the battle system with something that's known as the Gambit system. Now, although without getting too convoluted or technical here, tried to explain this as simply as I possibly could, this gives you the power to program each of your characters to perform actions in battle in response to specified conditions. So take the mage, for example. You might have 3 to 6 different actions for your mage character before going into battle. Maybe the first is, hey, anyone that has less than 70% of their health, ensure that you're healing them constantly so they're not dipping too deep and potentially dying. The next action you might have for that person is, hey, anyone on the battlefield from our party that has a status ailment, they're either paralyzed, they're poisoned, or something else altogether, make sure you're curing that status ailment. The third might be, hey, if anyone dies, make sure you revive them. What's unique about this Gambit system is that once it's configured, it's going to do the first thing that you've programmed that character to do first. So as long as everyone on the battlefield is 70% of their health or above, it's going to go to the next one, cure the status ailments. If all the status ailments are cured, then it's going to go to the third action, and it's going to revive anyone on the battlefield. While it might seem overly complex at first, trust me when I say that if my pea brain can wrap my head around it, I assure you that you can as well. I do not like my JRPGs to be overly complex. The simpler, the better. I remember on the surface, Xenoblade Chronicles did not look like something that was for me because it just looked too overly complicated, kind of MMO-like with that hotbar at the bottom. but once I ended up playing the definitive version on the Switch, it became one of my favorite JRPGs of all time. And in a very similar way, in those earlier hours of Final Fantasy XII, you have your tutorials to kind of walk you through and guide you along so you understand the finer mechanics of it all. And it's not super text heavy, it's not too overburdensome or seem like a chore to learn. But once you do and you really get your head around the gambit system, it becomes incredibly addicting to make these subtle tweaks to your gambits, to change the tide of boss battle, or swap back to another configuration when you just want to explore a landscape and grind levels. And to be perfectly honest, for the first half of the game, when I leveraged a guide to make sure that I had the right characters with the right gambits configured, I really didn't do a whole lot of tweaking to that until the second half of the game, where some of the boss battles became more complicated. So it's not like you're in menus all the time making these tweaks. If you do it well and you do it right earlier in the game, you're going to be fine for the majority of the rest of the game. At least I was, because I was grinding quite a bit and making sure my characters were leveled to the degree that they needed to be before going into dungeons or boss battles. I should also mention that the game gives you additional flexibility with how you structure your party, with these things called licenses, which are really just job classes, and each character can have 2. And once you assign a license to a character, it unlocks this chessboard of different attributes, and the more you battle, the more you level up, you unlock and accumulate this stuff called LP, which are just license points. As you accumulate these, you can spend them on a variety of things like new spells for your mage, increasing things like MP or HP, or unlocking the ability to equip your characters with new outfits, new armors, and new weapons. Overall, I adored the combat system in Final Fantasy XII, and I think it's what shines brightest in the game overall, and why, like I said earlier, I'm going to remember it fondly for years to come. Now, I can't talk about the Zodiac Age without highlighting some of the enhancements that come along with this remaster. From a gameplay perspective, as you might expect, some of the menu UI stuff has been changed to be a bit more streamlined. Unless you played the original on the PS2, this kind of stuff won't be too apparent. But what I will say is that navigating menus, whether you're buying items or you're upgrading your character, all of that stuff is super fluid, easy to use, and very intuitive. At least it was for me. From a graphical standpoint, as you might expect, it's had quite a facelift. It doesn't look like Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I wouldn't expect it to, because it wasn't a remake, it was a remaster of a game that came out nearly 17 years ago. But what I loved about the graphical style of Final Fantasy XII, similar to other games set in Ivalice, like Vagrant Story, like Final Fantasy Tactics, is that it has such a distinct graphical aesthetic to it that whether you're playing something on the PS1, PS2, or this remaster, I still think it looks good regardless of where you play it. And I think that's what makes the graphical style of 12 and any game set in this world so unique. From a sound design standpoint, the remaster allows you to go into the menu and change between the English and Japanese voice acting at any time. I use the English voice acting for the entirety of the game, but again, the remaster does give you the option to toggle that at any given moment. Similarly, you can use the originally recorded music or the newly recorded music for the game. You can also toggle that in the main menu at any point. And I just have to take a moment to compliment the soundtrack of Final Fantasy XII, because it is so good. It's composed by the brilliant Hitoshi Sakamoto, who fittingly enough also composed the soundtracks for both Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy Tactics. And more recently, you might know his work from Dragon's Crown, Muramasa, The Demon Blade, and he also recently composed the soundtrack for 13 Sentinels, Aegis Rim. And for Final Fantasy XII especially, very memorable. I've listened to the soundtrack quite a bit while I was going through the game, and long after the credits rolled, I know I'm going to continue to go back to that soundtrack because it so perfectly complements that steampunk, sky pirate world that Final Fantasy XII is going after. And then the next second you walk into a village and you're just overwhelmed with the relaxing, chill, atmospheric music that Hitoshi Sakamoto composed for this game. It's truly excellent stuff, and a soundtrack I will not forget for years to come. Now, the last enhancement I want to highlight is part of this remaster that most people will probably point to as being a complete game changer. I know it was for me, and it's the ability to go into the menu system at any point and either speed up time by 2 or 4. So you can basically in-game speed up the movement of your characters in battle by 2 or 4 in a similar way that you might listen to your podcast. You can speed up the audio by 2 or some other multiplication factor. And why this was such a game changer for me is because I love grinding in my JRPGs, as I'm sure anyone else that plays JRPGs likes to do, at least to some degree, right? And Final Fantasy XII, by a couple hours in, there was no way I could ever go back to the original game speed because it felt so slow. And what I've done is I've recorded footage of going into a marsh and having the multiplication factor or speeding up the game toggled off and then toggled on with ×2 speed. And as long as you have your gambit systems configured well, I tended to turn it off during boss battles just because you don't want the battle to get too out of hand, too fast, and then you have to kind of course correct, make sure your mage is working on overtime, healing everybody. But just for the sheer ability to go out into these open, sprawling environments when you're making your way to that next story area and just grind it out, level up your characters, it makes the pacing of the game seem much more fluid and much more satisfying, I guess I'll say. And probably in a similar way that if you've familiar with the original or you grew up with the original Pokemon games and you loved the satisfaction of grinding up each party, swapping each Pokemon to the front of the line, switching out your Magikarp to the front to get him to level 20 so you could evolve him to Gyarados. I love when, I think it was Pokemon X on 3DS that allowed for experience share for the entirety of the party. And I got a similar feeling in Final Fantasy XII by being able to speed up the pace of the game and the pace of combat because I felt like I could go out into the open world, grind a bunch for like 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and it felt, or it netted the experience points of what it otherwise probably would have taken me about 3 hours to grind up my party a couple levels before going into a battle. So definitely a game changer, loved it. And again, you can toggle this on and off to your heart's content. You can even target it to, I think, the L1 button. So if you're in battle, the heat of a boss battle, you can toggle it off at any moment as well. All right, so we've talked about the story, the characters, the music, the combat system, the enhancements that come with the Zodiac Age for Final Fantasy XII. But where does it compare to some of the other Final Fantasy games that I've played or beaten over the years? Ridiculously subjective question, right? And people often say that the first Final Fantasy game that you played is your favorite Final Fantasy game. And I think there's a lot of truth with that for me as well, because the first game in the series that I really sunk my teeth into was 9, which is cream of the crop, S tier Final Fantasy for me. But 13 was the first Final Fantasy game that I finished, hence the review that I posted on YouTube many years ago. And so for the sake of this kind of comparison, where does it compare among other Final Fantasies? I'm going to compare 13 and 12 with one another. So 13, everyone knows it's convoluted story with, you got to open up the data files to understand the LC versus the FALC versus the LAC and all of that other nonsense in between. But the cast in Final Fantasy 13, every single one of them, for me, even Snow, even Hope, love them. Beginning to end, was invested in their story arcs. The soundtrack in 13, one of the best in the series, one of the best JRPG soundtracks ever. Even people that don't like 13, I think can at least say strong things about the soundtrack. The combat system in 13, the paradigm stuff, loved it. Love, love, love the paradigm system in 13. So soundtrack, characters, combat, all three of those things, and it also being the first Final Fantasy game that I beat, really put 13 in S tier. When I compare that to something like 12, where I've already mentioned, the story's okay, it's good enough, characters, really only loved about 50% of them, but the combat system and the soundtrack in 12 really take it to that next level for me, and I think that's why I'm going to put it in A tier for now. I'm sure that'll change tomorrow. I'm sure in the weeks, months, and years to come, as I reflect on this list and I play more Final Fantasy games, I'm going to make subtle adjustments to this tiered ranking of games I've played in the series to this point. But right now, I really have strong, positive feelings about my experience with 12. And I think as time goes on, those feelings are only going to get stronger. But time will tell, right? I guess we'll have to see. But I hope that this review, as we kind of bring things to a close here, has encouraged other people to pick up 12, give it a chance. Because if I asked 100 people who are well-versed in JRPGs and Final Fantasy games what their favorite Final Fantasy games are, I feel like 99 people wouldn't even mention 12. They're going to mention 7. They're going to mention 9. Maybe they'll mention 4 or 6 from the earlier Final Fantasy game days. People will talk about 13 for its divisiveness, and even 15 when it was pretty divisive at launch. But I never hear people talking about 12. It's 7, it's 10, it's 4, it's 6. That's kind of like the top 4 or 5 Final Fantasy games that people talk about, and I just don't know why 12 doesn't get the love that I think it rightfully deserves. Yes, its story can be a little political with all the war stuff, but I think when you boil it down to its roots, it's really not that over the top. Yes, the combat system can be MMO-like, but once you get the hang of it, it's incredibly addicting, very satisfying to play. So I hope this review encourages at least one person to play 12, because I was so invested in that loop of going into that next sprawling open environment, grinding my characters with ×2 or ×4 speed, beating a boss battle, and then retreating back to a city, my team depleted of energy, all items, getting new armor, getting new weapons, configuring the licenses, everything that goes along with outfitting your characters to get ready and prepare them to go to that next step in a mammoth JRPG journey. 12 does all of that so well. Thoroughly enjoyed my time with it for all the reasons I've described at this point. So once again, I hope I can encourage at least one person out there to pick up 12 and play it. I'd love just to spark some conversation about the Final Fantasy series and 12 specifically, but what are some of your other favorite Final Fantasy games? Where am I off base with my tier ranking, or just my thoughts on the game? But I want to thank everyone so much for watching this review, and I'll see you in the next video.